So what are we talking about today? Gamers, writers, countrymen. Today, we're talking about the purpose of storytelling, or themes. One thing that's been tricky about conceptualizing these classes, because originally I wanted to start with characters, like building your protagonist, because that seems pretty foundational, right? Like you, as I stated last week, you kind of need some kind of character to have a story, right? But I decided that before we even go there, like when I was thinking about what I would say about the process of building characters, we needed to establish a bit more theory. So I'm hoping that next week, possibly the week after that, we'll get into a bit more nuts and bolts craft stuff. But for now, we're gonna sit here and we're gonna philosophize about my point of view on storytelling for a bit, because I think this is important. I think that there are a lot of ways to unpack the why of writing, the why of storytelling. Like, why do we tell stories? Why do we feel compelled to write them? Why do we enjoy them? Like, why, like, all that stuff. And obviously this is a subject with a lot of scholarship going back to like fucking Plato, right? But I'm not going to be citing any sources here. Again, there's a lot of scholarship on it, and people like dedicate their entire lives to this stuff, like narratology and what have you. If we wanted to go hard on the literary theory, we could, but I don't want to, so we're not. What's gonna be happening here is mostly my point of view. So, you know, take it or leave it. My relatively informed position. The purpose of storytelling is to get that J.K. Rowling money. First off, if that's the purpose, there are much safer bets than writing a book. However, why do people pay the J.K. Rowling money to, you know, for a nice story? And, you know, that's sort of what we're talking about today. We're going to get at the heart of it. So you can go forward and you can start whatever you're working on, whatever kind of tale you're spinning, whatever yarn you want to weave. You can go forth with purpose and be confident. And we're all about confidence. Okay, so yeah, we're going to start with the prompt first and foremost. To get us thinking about the purpose of storytelling, I want you to do some introspection. The prompt is this. You have a gun to your head. I, Professor Jackson, I've arrived, you know, I've cocked my pistol, I've got you tied to the chair, and like, you know, we're gonna go blammo on you, unless you can answer a simple question for me. If you don't tell me, your professor and kidnapper, what your favorite story is, the kidnapper will shoot. So this is something I know a lot of people have trouble with. Not everyone is as insane and meticulous as I am and enjoys making lists of like my top 5 whatevers. However, I'm looking for a gut reaction here, and this can be any kind of story. This could be a book, a movie, a game, etc. You know, I want you to take a minute, and to make it easier, I'll even give you like a hard time limit, so you can take a second to think like, okay, what are some movies I like, some games, some other stuff, and then at a certain point I'll go bam, and whatever you have in your mind, that's what you have to write about. So give it a minute. You know, we'll go ahead, you know, we'll load up the gun, we'll make sure it's clean. We don't want to have to shoot here, but we're a cruel, merciless kidnapper. We're hardened from years of literary crimes, so we'll shoot if we have to. I mean, there's just no getting around them. All right, you got about 10 seconds. You know, we got about 10 seconds before we fire. So hopefully within the countdown, you come to some sort of answer. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, kablamo! All right. So, congratulations. You've thought of your favorite story. Well, hey, you didn't get shot by this psychopathic kidnapper. Now what I want you to do is just take a paragraph, take a minute. We won't spend too long. This prompt is not as intensive as last week's. What I want you to do is try to explain why. Get out like a little sheet of paper, a little Word doc, and write just a quick paragraph for me about why that's your favorite story. Like, what about it sticks with you? And do that, do that as best as you can. Oh, that was a poorly timed yawn, but we're back. All right, we'll go ahead. Let's go ahead and move on. All right, so we'll get started with the lesson proper. Why do we tell stories? Who is this man? Is he relevant to our purposes today? Not really. This is Rene Descartes. He's a philosopher. He's famous for stuff. He's famous for I think therefore I am. That's it. That's the one. And a bunch of other things. So, I mostly put him here though because he looks very thoughtful, like Artsy says. Got that fly haircut. And we're getting pretentious, we're getting theoretical today. And we're thinking about the purpose of art, the purpose of storytelling. And I guess before we even get started on answering that question, I wanted to take a second and address maybe another concern of like why do we need to talk about this? Like, are we thinking about this too hard? Like, should we just tell our story and hope everything that works out? And the answer to that question is potentially yes. So everyone's process is going to look different, and there is no one correct way to go about writing your story. As long as the story gets done and it's up to your standards and, you've expressed what you want to express, that's the most important thing, right? So the process is going to be a lot with what makes you work as an individual. Now we'll talk more about the process. I think especially there are different tactics you can use for longer stories in particular. I think that's less of a concern with short stories. Not to say that you can't spend a long time really polishing a short story, but 20 pages is a different beast from like 300 pages. So we'll probably talk about process with a eye towards novels and book-length nonfiction and screenplays and stuff like that at some point. But for now, while we're talking about the why, I want to propose a dichotomy that I'm going to refer to a lot, that famous popular writer, acclaimed writer George R.R. Martin likes to use. And that George R.R. Martin says that fundamentally there are two types of writers. There's the architect and the gardener. And overall, I think this is overall pretty true. Now, every person is going to have some combination of these things. Some people will be more architect, some people will be more gardener. There probably are people that are like somewhere in the middle. But the thing about this dichotomy is that I think identifying what kind of writer you are will help you do more effective work in the future. So the architect, as the name sort of implies, is all about the plan. It's all part of the plan, see? Architect likes outlines, they like diagrams, they like, knowing the arcs in advance, and having all the endings and plotted out and all that good stuff. Really focusing on, a lot of pre-writing to make the actual writing go as smooth as possible. The gardener, meanwhile, likes to take things a lot more naturally, like take it as it comes, do less planning, and find the story through the process of writing more so. So instead of doing a lot of planning, they'll, just keep going as much as their brain will take them. They'll just keep writing, and maybe they'll find it in the edit, they'll definitely find it in the edit. And that's sort of the other approach. Now, obviously, there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these ways of working. With the gardener, Game of Thrones is actually a really good example for how this gets you into trouble, because one of the reasons that it's taking so long for him to write these books is that Martin, by, sort of planting the seeds of his story and having the idea with only, like, a vague, like, he said that he knew what the ending was, and it probably looks like the horrible one we got in the show, right? But, like, as far as actually developing that into something not horrible, which I still think he can do, the problem is that, like, you know, A Song of Ice and Fire has grown so huge and so out of control by his own admission that without that, like, scaffolding, it is hard for him to, you know, get back on track. He wrote himself into a corner, basically. And that's something that probably will not happen to the Architect. Or if it does, it'll be a lot easier for the Architect to wiggle his way out of it because they put more time into that plan and they can go and, like, check their diagrams and stuff and all that. However, the Architect is not without their own disadvantages. I'm comfortable saying this because I am more of an architect. The problem with being an architect is if you are, because I think what defines the, one of the defining things and kind of the reason I'm bringing this up in like a roundabout way, the defining trait of an architect is that they're more analytical, and the defining trait of a gardener is that they go more on intuition. And that is not a statement of quality, I want to stress enough. It is not that architects, I'm not like here gassing myself up saying that like architects are better or smarter. In fact, I think that, you know, there's plenty of problems that being too formal and too dedicated to your outline and not allowing the story to grow beyond what you initially planned, like, you know, picking it apart over and over again to the point where you, like, you know, crush the, you know, let alone the, like, quality of the final product, just crushing the joy of working on the thing. That's a real problem that architects often run into. We come back around then. Can you be too analytical about writing? And can you, like, do so much of it to a science that, like, you remove the joy from the process, you remove the creativity? Honestly, I think that you can. I don't think that lessons like these or other creative writing books or craft books, I don't think that qualifies. I think that usually when we talk about, like, overanalyzing our own work, we're talking about our own work, like, sitting right in front of us. You know, nitpicking something to death. Rather than just, you know, sitting here and getting a different perspective. I encourage you to read other craft books, to look to other sources. I have some recommendations if anyone would be interested. Maybe I'll make like a database, like a document list. So yeah, just bringing this back around to like the purpose of why we tell stories. This is definitely like an architect lesson. And I think it's important that I clarify that is my headspace a lot. I like pre-writing. I like diagrams. I like having a lot of plans, even if I change those plans, which I often do. I like having the, you know, the map ahead of me, because I don't want to like end up in a corner. That anxiety that fills me with anxiety. So yeah, this is an architect question, and maybe if you're a gardener, maybe thinking about this stuff will give you something analytical to grab on to like help you if you're like struggling at any part of the process. So with that all out of the way, we can finally talk about what we came here to talk about, which is the main question of, well, why do we tell stories anyway? And the short answer is there's a lot of reasons, and we'll go through a few of them, just real quick like here. So I think the one that we jump to, the most obvious one, is this idea of like the morality tale or the fable or the parable. You know, this is something we learn from a very early age. Like as kids, we are often told stories that have some sort of obvious lesson that that you can take away from and like apply to your own life. Like for example, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The idea behind The Boy Who Cried Wolf is that you take this thing, this principle that we don't want children to do, which is, you know, don't lie. That's the point of the point of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And we illustrate that with a little story. Like, okay, if you lie this time and you lie that time. Eventually, like when people need to rely on you and you need people to believe you, they're not going to, because you have that history of behavior. This is why, you know, I have a picture of Jesus there. with religion. All religions are basically some kind of big story, right? Depending on your point of view and your belief, those stories may or may not be true ones. Even ignoring, rather, the, legitimacy of any given theology, they still take the form of stories, right? At least all the ones that I'm familiar with, and especially, like, the Abrahamic religions. And that, like, not only in, I grew up Christian, so, like, I'm most familiar with that. Not only in, like, the Bible do you have, like, the broader, like, meta-narrative. There is a broader narrative of, like, God creating the world, and then he sends Jesus to Earth as this human, human incarnation, and then, through human folly, like, Jesus sacrificed himself, and that leads into, like, all the crazy shit that happens in Revelation, right? It's a story. So there's, like, a broad story, but then, obviously, there's a lot of smaller stories within that. Usually, the point of those smaller stories is to illustrate some, moral principle. Parable of the prodigal son, Cain and Abel, there's hundreds of them. The thing about morality is that I'm using pretty, like, simple examples, like Aesop's fables, nursery rhymes, children's stories, religion. So, I'm using these simpler examples, but this applies to any story, more or less, right? Because any story is going to be filtered through the point of view of the author, and it's going to be filtered through morally the way they see the world, the way that their values, like, even if the point of a story isn't to be outright propaganda for a certain set of principles, even just by implicitly having a protagonist, a point of view character, and having someone oppose them, like, a protagonist antagonist, like, who you designate as those things will often say something about, like, the moral standing of the author and what they think that the, what sort of ideals they should emulate. And again, like, Hollywood movies tend to be as simple as, like, fables or, religious stories. Avengers, the first Avengers movie, and I think this is actually a good example, like, I really love this movie still, despite having kind of burnt out on Marvel, is that, the first Avengers movie exists with the simple moral, basically, that teamwork is nice, and also you should buy more Marvel stuff, but mostly that teamwork is nice. And I think that the movie, even though it's a really simple idea, like, a lot of the stuff in that movie is built around that moral, and I think that's one of the things that, like, made the Avengers endure as like an institution up to being the most popular franchise, and that, like, you have this cast of characters. I mean, it's a form of storytelling, like, as old as time. You have a cast of characters, a bunch of guys who are a bunch of assholes and, like, type A personalities, and they don't really get along, and they gotta learn to get along for the greater good. Extremely simple moral, but it's there. Arguably the most popular franchise on the planet. So clearly those kind of simple stories still resonate with us. So I that's about all I have to say about morality, because this is sort of like, the reason we're starting here is that this is kind of our baseline, right? Like, when you're in high school and they ask, like, what's the point of telling a story? Usually we think about this, like, campfire, religious or pseudo-religious imparting of values. And it's definitely part of it, but I don't think that's the only part. While we're sitting here thinking about it, I've used the word theme already. Often we're taught in high school, and especially, like, earlier, if it does come up, that theme is just, like, the moral of the story, right? I don't think that's quite correct, but that is a good way of understanding it. Like, and I think that shows how much weight we put on this idea that stories are sort of moral guideposts. And so we'll move on. We'll see if we can find some other reasons to tell stories. And so really this is sort of a similar thing, but on a broader scale. So I would argue that, like, you can say the basic level is saying that stories are about morality. I think the actual answer is to go one further and say that telling stories is about rhetoric. And what do I mean by rhetoric? Well, rhetoric is basically the art of persuasion. Like, how do you convince someone that your point of view is correct and they should follow what you believe and what you're doing. Obviously, morality plays a big part in that. But, you know, we often apply rhetoric to questions that aren't moral questions, you know, questions of fact, questions of efficiency. So, you know, and stories can engage in that kind of stuff too. You know, granted, a lot of those questions will usually have a moral component, but I think that we can think about it in this broader level. I would argue that just by nature of being written by a human with a perspective, even if they're trying to be objective, every story has some sort of rhetoric going on. And, you know, rhetoric refers to both like the art of persuasion and also as like a noun to refer to the individual tactics. So, you know, when I say that somebody has effective rhetoric, like maybe I'm talking about like a political figure or a preacher or something like that, the thing, like when you say that, you're not just talking about like that they are persuasive, you're talking about how they're persuasive. You're talking about like, think about like, I don't know, Bernie Sanders, like, you know, his big yelling like, oh, we need healthcare, hey, I'm walking in, like, you know, that we the people stuff. Like that's a sign of good rhetoric. And like, you know, that's obviously very important to politics, but important to stories as well. A lot of stories ultimately are trying to validate or either validate the author's worldview for themselves or like convince the world at large that a certain course of action needs to be taken. Again, very much ties into morality, but it doesn't have to be that way necessarily. Like it could even be again, statements of fact, like illustrating some sort of concept or what have you. But I bring this up because I think that this is maybe the broadest umbrella we could think about storytelling in. Even if it doesn't seem like a story is trying to be persuasive, there probably are some implicitly persuasive elements about it. Like even just making a statement. So like Camus, The Stranger, I don't know how many of you had to read that book in high school. That doesn't seem like an especially persuasive story. A dude just shoots a guy, and, you know, the story is basically about like, why did he do it? Well, for like no reason, because the world is nonsense. Even if like The Stranger as a theme isn't making like a moral statement, like we should be acting like this guy who shot a stranger. You know, I don't think the story is saying that. But by observing, isn't the world cruel and random and pointless? That's a kind of rhetoric by, you know, putting the story out there and illustrating it in a way that's palpable to a reader to try and get people to see the world the way that Camus sees it. Well, if you ever read that book, it's a solid book. You know, if you're interested in some more like literary fiction, I remember enjoying it. But I'm also an extremely cynical man, so your mileage may vary. Okay, we'll come back to rhetoric, but I think that'll do for now. Yeah, so another thing that I think is tied into it, but worth noting on its own, I mentioned this idea of like, you know, gathered around like the storyteller and like, you know, telling these stories to children. One of the reasons that we tell stories is just community and like socialization. And, you know, I use the image of like the campfire here, this idea of like gathering together around a central point to like talk about your story, to, you know, get told a story and like bond with each other. But it doesn't even have to be that formal. Like when I'm on stream here, or like when Connor, because Connor's really good at this, when Connor's on stream and he's telling all of these stories about like, you know, the hug man, like I drove him home, like, oh, what a wacky time, and like we all as like a streaming audience form like a shared language with inside jokes and references about those stories. That's a form of community building, and that also happens, you know, we do that in our day-to-day lives, just like talking to each other, but we also do that with like more formal, like commercialized fiction, right? Now, it's interesting because the way that we form communities around stories has changed thanks to the internet and like stuff kind of splintering off into a billion different like directions and subchannels. But you know, the classic examples like the water cooler TV show, like the show that everyone watches, Game of Thrones, was the most recent high profile example of this, where like even if you didn't watch Game of Thrones, you couldn't escape it. People were talking about it all the time. It's like, you know, you go into the office after, you know, watching the newest episode of Game of Thrones on the weekend, and then you come back and you talk about it with your friends, miss it, you're sitting with your head down all day because you want to like cover your ears and like avoid spoilers. That's kind of the community experience. And there's something about following like especially a long form narrative that'll do that. And although again, stuff has splintered, like that still happens. That's the reason there's fandom, is that like we get together to discuss these things that mean something to us. So even if it is, I think that like these various streams, like, you know, me and all the other like small streamers that have formed a little community here, or rather they formed a community and I slid in like a parasite, that in and of itself is kind of a narrative. The narrative of Connor, the narrative of Seabeard, the narrative of Leo. Like, as online content creators, like, you're following the people and you're following for the story. Like, oh, we're gonna tune in, like, what is up with funny Twitch person? And, you know, I think that's great. I think that's a really valuable part of the you know, narrative experience, and it takes a lot of forms. So yeah, I think we can move on. And finally, these are, by the way, this list of like why we tell stories, nowhere near comprehensive, I'm sure. Like, you know, people have been talking about this since, again, like Plato time, so I'm sure that I'm forgetting some. But I think that this is a good section of what you might be thinking about when you're starting your story, just starting out. And one in particular that's very common with fiction, especially like big budget movies and video games, is wish fulfillment. Or like, you know, sometimes it's called other things. But I think this is the broadest category because wish fulfillment can mean a lot of things. Escapism, also. The way a story engages with this idea of escapism is going to change from story to story, from genre to genre. So in a action movie, you know, I have Goku and Dragon Ball listed there. In an action movie, you know, the escapism is like a power fantasy. Like, I want to be strong, I want to be cool, I'm going to embody, like, you know, or project myself onto this character, whether that's, you know, Goku, Superman, Iron Man, John McClane, you know, hundreds and hundreds of examples. You know, cowboys were the hot ticket, like, back in the day. And, you know, I want to feel like I'm a real cool guy and, like, get into exciting adventures and all that stuff. But then you have something like a romance, like, you know, we brought up Twilight earlier as a joke, but Twilight is actually a great example of this. The reason that that book was so popular was that it too served a kind of wish fulfillment from a different angle, and that the wish fulfillment is, like, I want to feel like I have this really pure love, that, like, this great, super attractive person is, like, taking care of me and, like, always looking out for me. You know, that is also as much a kind of wish fulfillment as I want to be strong and punch people. And wish fulfillment has sort of or escapism rather, has sort of a negative connotation in a lot of circles, but I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to write, like, action movies or romances. I think that you should be aware of, like, maybe some of the traps or the negatives or the unfortunate, like, implications you can have on a story. But oftentimes wish fulfillment stories can be, like, genuinely really inspiring. And so, you know, when they're done right. So, for example, the reason I have Dragon Ball listed here is that Dragon Ball follows a very, very repetitive structure in that you have Goku. You start at the beginning of the series, you have little boy Goku, who is born strong, but he is not the strongest. And each successive arc, you know, brings him to a new level. He grows up. he achieves Super Saiyan, he achieves godhood, he achieves Ultra Instinct, and, you know, by the time, you know, 30 years on, we've now gone to the point where Goku is, like, sneezing universes away. But the reason that's satisfying, and why I would argue that Dragon Ball, or at least parts of it, are a good story, is that, like, everything in the story sort of funnels back into this idea of self-improvement, of, like, being the best that you can possibly be. Like, people don't look up to Goku just because he's strong. There are plenty of characters that are strong, but I think what resonates about Dragon Ball is that in a lot of those sequences, Goku has to work for it. And so not only do we get the vicarious experience of watching a cool guy, like, you know, blow away, like, you know, some dude with an enormous, like, laser, we also feel satisfied knowing that, like, this is a character achieving a goal that encourages us to achieve our own goals. I think it's no accident, you know, the few times that I've been to the gym and I happen to be wearing a hoodie that had the, you know, Goku's kanji on the back of it, like, there's always, like, every time, like, these enormous, like, ripped, like, absolute bros who, like, see me in the locker room, they're like, hey, like, Dragon Ball, yeah! Because, you know, a lot of people take that literally, a lot of people get into fitness because of shows like that. But, you know, I am obviously not a big fitness guy, I'm a schlub. But even then, like, thinking about, like, oh, I want to be, like, the best writer I can be. Like, that drive for, like, self-improvement is something that really stuck with me in my experiences watching the show, and something that really resonated with me, even though it is a form of wish fulfillment. So basically, I just want to take a minute to talk about this, and that, like, you know, people tend to look down at their noses at, like, something that can be classified as wish fulfillment, but, like, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. And, you know, you shouldn't be made to feel bad about a story just because it's got some, like, wish fulfillment elements. I would argue that most stories tend to, except for, like, the really miserable ones. So, yeah, that's all that I have to say about that. I just went on a big old rant about Dragon Ball, because I love it. The common thread, when you get down to it, I think, is that stories are about reaching truth via feeling. And that seems maybe counterproductive. Like, you've probably seen the Ben Shapiro memes, like, facts don't care about your feelings. But I'm not necessarily talking about, like, capital T, the truth. Like, exploring the truth of, like, quantum physics. I'm talking about, like, you know, the expressing your experience, expressing the way that you perceive the world, sort of your truth, and communicating that to other people, and kind of getting them on your side. Like, that's where we come back to this idea of rhetoric, right? And I want to return to rhetoric because I think this is a really important distinction, in that there are a lot of ways to be persuasive, and stories are a very good way of doing that. But the reason that stories are persuasive is that they are driven by emotion. So you have probably read a book or watched a movie or something that at one point or another where, like, the audience, a character, like, turns to the camera and, like, goes on a 10-minute rant that is just so clearly, like, the author, like, you know, typing up a storm, like, ooh, I'm gonna, like, tell everyone my philosophy. The most famous example of this is Atlas Shrugged, which has, like, 60 pages of a character just, like, explaining the philosophy of objectivism to, like, a captive audience. That book is, like, 1,000 pages long. And Atlas Shrugged is often criticized for that, and in our modern storytelling sensibilities, we tend to look down on that stuff. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, like, nobody wants to get preached to. Like, even a literal preacher, right? Like, someone literally giving a sermon will be able to spin their story in a way that doesn't feel like he's talking down to, like, his flock, right? So I think as people, like, when we're just kind of told what to do, even if a lot of the stuff being outlined is true or logical, we don't care. The purpose of a story is to tap into people's feelings and make people come to a conclusion by saying something that feels true to them. Inception is one of my favorite movies of all time. And there's a common reading of that movie that it's actually about filmmaking, and that's, like, you know, you have all these people as different parts of production, but the ultimate point of Inception is to sort of spin the story in a mind of a character and, like, make him come to the conclusion they want really naturally. I think that if you look at Inception from this rhetoric angle, like, even if you don't buy into the filmmaking angle, there's something about that central metaphor that really resonates, right? So it's kind of brilliant that it's explaining this concept while also illustrating it. That, like, you can't just say, like, you can't walk up to the guy who you want to dissolve his, like, multinational company and say, dissolve your multinational company. You got to go in there and illustrate and get him in his feelings why that's a good idea. And that's a story. Like, that's a theme. You know, you're getting at some deeper meaning and trying to make your audience you know, agree with you on that. Our next slide here, which is themes, and basically when I say that you should be writing with theme in mind, which I really do, I try to be really cognizant of my themes. This is where maybe a lot of the gardeners in the audience will sort of cringe and be like, well, all right, if it sounds like I'm writing for theme, like, isn't that going to turn into exactly what you just said not to do? You know, make a story that's a sermon that's all about preaching some moral. And if you're not careful, it can turn into that. I'm not going to lie to you. But I think that's more so than going in with a specific moral, having a solid idea of, like, what's motivating you to write the story. Like, what is the core feeling, the core truth that you are trying to express? I think going back and watching and writing with an eye for that can be really helpful. And to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to use the example of my own book, which isn't out yet. So the thing about my book is that I talked in the last session about generating ideas, that, like, with my current novel, my two main characters, Chris and Kelly, I had been writing a bunch of different stories starring some versions of those two characters for a while now. And after a while, I just had to ask myself, like, what is it about this character, or this set of characters, or this dynamic, that I can't let go of? Like, what is about them that really speaks to me? And ultimately, like, this isn't a spoiler, like, this is on the back cover copy of the book, I'd say that primarily the central tension in my book is that it's about a friendship that is being threatened, that has grown distant. And I don't think it's an accident that when I wrote the very first iteration of these characters, I was in high school and going through some changes in my life, and that I had one friend in particular who's a little older than me, who I would talk to, like, every day, who, like, you know, even though I've never lived close to in my life, like, we'd always talk on the phone and, like, talk online and, like, play games. And, you know, that was really helpful to me when I was having a hard time in middle school. But because he was a little older, when I was about halfway through high school, he went off to college and, like, you know, started talking to me less. And, you know, that made me sad because, you know, he was busy with his own things. Like, I understood. It wasn't, like, a big drama. But even though, like, it's not like, you know, there was this, like, book full of conflict about, like, you know, the bitterness about my friend going to college, that core feeling, that core sadness, that core truth that, like, a friendship that's really valuable can be threatened, that was so important to me that I continued writing about it long after, like, that had stopped being an issue in my life. Like, I still talk to this person quite frequently. And, so the thing about, you know, this theme is that, like, I want to get away from this idea of themes as, like, the moral of the story, because I think that is what leads to, like, Atlas Shrugged, or I mean, there's a couple of, like, I mean, I've read plenty of shitty books where, like, I walked away thinking, like, man, like, get down from your soapbox, dude. Like, I'm here to, like, tell a story. I'm here to have you tell me a story, you know? I'm not here to listen to you, like, give me a philosophy lecture. Because there are, the thing about a story is that, like, you need to take advantage of the elements that make it unique. That, like, you need to capture those emotions. You need to, like, get people invested. Otherwise, why are you not just writing, like, a philosophy paper, like a research paper? If your goal is pure logic, there are more effective ways to do that. And so I think that, like, theme, if we think about theme as, like, a meaning or, like, a lowercase t truth, and we get away from thinking about, like, the lessons learned, I think that opens up even someone who's more of a gardener to write with theme in mind. I have this idea that I want to write a story about a friendship that is threatened. And then once you have that, even if, like, you're not going in with the explicit moral of, like, oh, you should never, ever betray your friends or something, like, pedestrian like that, you could still say, like, you know, once, especially if you wrote your first draft, you're going back in the edit and you can, like, make those connections and, like, tie things back to that central theme, and make it really effective. And that's why, I mean, I'm going to be talking about theme a lot because I think it's important to have some sort of core. I think that's the best way to think about it, actually. The theme is kind of the core of your story. Like, it's not just why are we telling stories in general? Why are we telling this story specifically? Like, what about this story did you need to get out there? Because Kelly Was Unbreakable was a story that I didn't just write because I wanted to make some money. It was a story that I had in my heart that I felt like I needed to get out there. Like, you know, I needed some variation of these characters to work, to express something that I thought was important about me and my perspective to the world. And, you know, that sounds really, you know, pretentious and, like, grandstandy, but I do think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's just the act of writing. Like, we all kind of assume that we have something to say that's valuable, and I think you have to run with that. Yeah, you know, so I guess there's my own sermon, speaking of rhetoric. Yeah, ultimately, you know, speaking of Game of Thrones, I've been talking about Game of Thrones a lot because, it's a really good example of a lot of this stuff. So you may be familiar with this quote, this infamous quote from one of the clown showrunners. When I asked Benioff and Weiss if it was possible to infer any overall intentionality to the upcoming 10 episodes, they sneered. Themes are for 8th grade book reports, Benioff told me. Now, hopefully, I've gotten you to, you know, get past this notion that themes have to be some sort of, like, moralizing. And hopefully you can just see on your own what a stupid fucking statement this is for, like, a professional to say. Even if you are a gardener, like, George R.R. Martin's a pretty big gardener, like, and, you know, infamously such a big gardener that he's gotten himself into trouble. Game of Thrones is a lot of fucking themes. It's got a lot to say about, like, society and morality and all that shit. So the fact that one of the showrunners for, like, such a thematically rich work would say this was a big red flag that as soon as they couldn't, like, rely on Martin's actual writing, it was all gonna go to shit, and of course it did. Yeah, so, again, don't be this clown. Don't think that, like, these terms, this, like, theory crafting is just all useless fluff. I mean, it's not, like, concretely useful in the way that, like, building a car is, but, like, even though you can nitpick a story to death and be too analytical that way and, like, you know, deprive it of life, I think that having a working knowledge of these sort of terms and the mechanics of storytelling can't hurt you. Like, you won't, like, having an eye for theme, even as a gardener, I don't think that's gonna hurt you. And, yeah, so go forward and, like, don't be afraid to, like, be a little vulnerable and say something, because that's kind of the point of storytelling overall, right? Even in schlock like the Avengers, even in schlock like Dragon Ball, there's a core to that. You know, get stronger, self-improvement, teamwork is good. And even in those simple stories, that core is arguably what makes them work and what makes them popular. I love simple stories. I love genre fiction. So, yeah, I think even a simple theme executed well is a beautiful thing. All right. So, I'd be remiss to not mention the darker side of all this. The dark side of storytelling, the dark side of themes, the dark side of rhetoric, which is, of course, propaganda. The line between a story and effective rhetoric and propaganda is very thin, debatably non-existent, depending on how much you want to interpret like a moral statement as propaganda. So here, I mean, I just found this like 50s ass, like anti-communism propaganda, but like it takes a lot less obvious forms, and the more effective forms of it usually are a lot less obvious. So I'm assuming most of you had to take some sort of composition class at some point. And when I teach composition, I go out of my way to teach about like logical fallacies, and one of them is the appeal to emotion. But wait, you're thinking, if stories are all about convincing people with an appeal to emotion, is that a bad thing? Well, no, obviously stories, are a big important part of like society and human interaction. But the reason that it's a logical fallacy is that a story, a well done appeal to emotion, can convince you of something that is not true or bad. And that's what propaganda is. And like this is why, like, when we talk about whether or not a story is harmful, I tend to be of the belief that the effects of an individual story are often overstated to fit like a convenient narrative. However, it's unquestionable that every single piece of media that we consume informs our worldview. And if we consume only bad media that's like shitty and overly simplistic or toxic or propagandistic or anything like that, that can lead people down some bad roads, because a simple story, and kind of the dark side, sure, it's nice to like look at the Avengers or look at Dragon Ball and say like, oh, teamwork is nice, self-improvement is good, but another simple story is like, we're gonna blame all of society's problems on a group of people. And that's when you get fascism. And fascism is bad. And fascism only happens because of this weaving these narratives. So like, there are real consequences to stories. And I'm not saying this to like discourage anyone from like writing, accidentally writing something that's like problematic or whatever. You're a human being. Something about your writing is gonna be problematic. Like it's inconceivable to like write something that is morally pure or whatever. But I am saying that appeals to emotion are very powerful things, especially very powerful things when used for evil. You are not immune to propaganda. And that's kind of all I have to say about that. So this week's homework, simple stuff. I'm not asking you to go outside your comfort zone this time. What I want you to do for this week is look at the answer that you gave to your favorite story in the first prompt. Just read through that prompt again. Think about your answer in the context of what we've talked about today. Now rewrite that paragraph, attempting to identify themes, even simple ones, about that story that really stuck with you. Like, what is the core that made that story so important to you that like gun to your head, you picked it as your favorite story. And yeah, I guess other than that, that's it. I won't set aside separate time. You guys can do that on your own time. We can maybe talk about how it went next week, but I think as far as the lecture goes, we're basically done.